that he couldn't have gained access to the house because he didn't have keys for it, and that he'd been locked out of the house and therefore couldn't go in.
The finding of the keys, or putting of this information to Brian, was a significant point in the interview, because the police were able to demonstrate to Brian that the account that he'd given to them simply wasn't true up until this point.
Now is the time also to change our interview tactics, and more importantly our interview team, because I wanted Brian to consider this important piece of evidence being unfamiliar with the people who were talking to him. He was then interviewed by 2 different people, and during the course of that Brian then confessed.
I had during the day been putting up pictures on my wall. I'd just come into the lounge and started having a discussion. It got to a violent stage in the arguments with my dad, where I obviously felt under pressure enough to push back, and I struck him with the soft side of the hammer. You know, the part you hammer a nail in with. It knocked him back slightly. It was a split reaction. My mum was in the kitchen, obviously heard the commotion and everything. She came in with a carving knife up in a stabbing motion, obviously for self-defense. I swung more than anything, swung the hammer just to get myself free. I'm not sure who exactly I've struck, where, how many times or anything. And I remember I did take the knife. I just remember my dad lying in his seat. And there was some blood coming up. My mum said, "What did you do, Boo?"
Brian Blackwell Sr. and his wife Jacqueline have been stabbed and bludgeoned to death by their teenage son, Brian. After confessing to the horrific crime, Brian claims he killed his doting parents during a violent row. But police forensics give a very different picture of what happened on that fateful day.
Brian Blackwell Sr. had sustained massive head injuries consistent with being struck repeatedly with a hammer or other similar object. He had several stab wounds to the left side of his face. He'd suffered stab wounds to the upper chest, and significantly he'd suffered stab wounds, slash wounds to his arms and hands. And the forensic science opinion was that, and indeed the pathologist's opinion was that those marks on Brian Blackwell Sr.'s hands and arms were entirely consistent with defensive injuries. So it's apparent that he was the subject of a savage and violent attack whilst he was sat in the chair. There is no evidence whatsoever of any other struggle taking place in that room. There was no upturned furniture. There was nothing broken. There was no evidence at all of any kind of fight or other physical altercation that was in any way consistent with what Brian had alleged.
I spoke to him for a bit and told him I still loved him. I probably believed what I'd done. I saw my mum and she seemed alive.
When you say she seemed...
She didn't look cold or like a dead person. I thought she may still be alive. But for some reason I can't honestly explain. I pulled into the bathroom. I think I splashed some water on it and asked her to come back.
It's very difficult to say what sort of remorse he actually demonstrated, because certainly they found that he was a fairly manipulative sort of young man who was able to put on whatever face seemed to be acceptable to the events. Yes, he became upset, but whether that was true remorse, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure it was.
The thing was, though, I didn't think that the blade had particularly gone in deep, because I don't know how easily a blade goes into somebody, but it was just short jabs. It's probably the blade was like an inch away from him each time. And with my mum, and I couldn't see it because he was very close. I thought it was barely. But I can't believe that someone would die so easily. It seemed like just a bit of commotion. I couldn't believe that someone would have died so easily from that.
2 days after his arrest, Brian Blackwell was charged with the murder of his parents. The people closest to Brian couldn't believe this intelligent, quiet and polite young man could be responsible for such a brutal crime.
It's an awful cliche, and I don't know how many people say it in tragic circumstances, but